Hello for the 29th Sunday in Ordinary Time, using the Gospel, Mark 10:35-45, and the first reading, Isaiah 53:10-11. And we see in the Gospel James and John. James and John are the two of the three favorites of Jesus, I think. Peter, James, and John. And these two, and Peter too, even they had misunderstandings of what Jesus was about to do or was doing and what the kingdom of God really means. And so these two of the three favorites, with their misunderstanding, they want to sort of be close to Jesus when he's going to overthrow the Romans and become king. And one wants to guarantee that he and me, one will sit at your right, one will sit at your left in the kingdom after you get rid of the Romans. And we do this thing right. Really. Well, that incident, Jesus talks about servants and power and authority and slaves and so forth. Well, what does he do? When we look at the governments in the world or in nations or in states, or the church in the world or in dioceses, or we look at some families in our own lives, when authority is treated differently. Let's get to the mind of Jesus and the mind of James and John and you and me. The Latin word for authority is auctor. And auctor has two English translations. One is power, and the other is authority. So authority has to do with power. And that's what it's all about. James and John wanted Jesus with his power to overcome the Romans and be established and be one on the right and one on the left in the kingdom of God. Jesus gives his classic answer to that, to their misunderstanding. He says, well, first of all, everybody who wants to be first needs to be the slave to all. If you want to see under my right hand or my left hand, you must be the slave of all. That's where power really is. When you try to help all, you're there for all, you're the slave of all, you better said, you're the servant of all. Very often in our prayer lives, when we raise our mind and heart to God and when we ask for, give me this, give me that. Help me for this, help me for that. Make my dying mother not die and live to longevity. Help my dying grandpa and cure him. And we try to use the power of Jesus to be subservient to us. And sometimes that's where it gets lost. We just think of ourselves and not the other, and not the basic message of Jesus Christ. Sometimes we do that, we barter, or we make an agreement with God, and you kiss the lottery ticket and say, Jesus, God, if you help me win this one, 900 million or something this week. 900 million? Don't worry, I'll give you half. That might help him to pick my ticket. We barter with God. We want the authority and the power of God in my hands to do what I want. And Jesus says, no, no, that's not authority. That's not the proper use of power. Your authority is not to lord it over people and get them to do what you want. And he says, and make your authority felt. He says, no, if you want to be great, you got to be the servant. Or he even says it's harder to stomach, the slave of all. If you want to be first and most important, you got to be the servant or the slave of all. Isn't that a wonderful idea of authority? Wouldn't you like to perceive in our nations servant of all? Wouldn't you like to see in our government the servant of all? Wouldn't you like to see in our church the servant of all? My heavens, we should have the greatest insight into what authority and how authority ought to be used. Some of our bishops haven't done it over the years with this abuse case. Some of our governments haven't done it, what they want to try to do to make people their slaves or their servants. No. First, serve. Whom? All. There's once again that perfect goal of Jesus. Was Mother Teresa a servant of all, especially the poor? Did St. Francis of Assisi reach out to all? Does our present Pope reach out to all nations, all people, all the time? Well, and it always comes back to us, doesn't it? Am I a servant for all? A servant for many? A servant for most? Do I have authority? And how do I exercise it? Well, you can look at the world. You can look at some of the weaknesses in the church. And you can look at your own self in the mirror and say, what is true authority for me? And how do I use maybe the teeny bit of the authority that I have in my life? And am I a servant of all? Do I try to make other people first? That's the message of Jesus. It's really a perfect message. The more you serve, the better you are. The more you serve, the happier you will be. I think those special people, Peter, James, and John, they wound up being terribly good servants, and they did it very much for all. But it certainly seemed to be a long time in coming. It certainly wasn't immediately when they met Jesus Christ. Reread that gospel. We all can take that to heart. Have a good day.